Step out. Open the trunk. Halsey's hand rested on his holster. Justine kept both palms flat on the wheel. Not without a warrant. Halsey slapped his palm against the glass, the sound cracking through the quiet road. Beside her, Simone froze, seatbelt biting into her shoulder. Last warning. He circled to the passenger's side, boots crunching gravel, eyes narrowing at the Maybach's polished hood like it personally offended him. Simone's hand found her mother's sleeve. Justine squeezed once. Steady. Stay still, she murmured, and stay recording. Halsey's radio crackled unanswered at his hip. He unclipped the baton from his belt, metal scraping loud in the dark. The first strike cracked the driver's window dead center, glass spiderwebbing before it collapsed inward across Justine's lap in a glittering shower. A younger deputy stood back near the cruiser. "Registration's clean, sir," he called out. Halsey didn't turn his head. He reached through the broken frame, popped the lock himself, and hauled Justine out by the arm hard enough to wrench her shoulder. On the phone held up from the roadside, the county land office confirmed the Maybach's registration matched her name exactly, filed months earlier. Halsey glanced at the screen for half a second, then looked away. "Paperwork gets faked," he said, and reached for the trunk latch anyway. Simone climbed out shaking, phone raised, thumb already on record, capturing broken glass glittering across the asphalt shoulder. Inside the wrecked door panel, a small green light blinked steadily. A dash recorder Halsey hadn't noticed was still running. Halsey's eyes caught the blinking light. His jaw tightened. He reached in and yanked the small recorder loose from its mount. "That's evidence," Justine said, voice level despite the glass still clinging to her sleeve. "You need to log it properly." He pocketed the memory card without a word, tossing the empty recorder body onto the passenger seat like trash. "I want a chain of custody form," Justine said. Halsey's mouth curled. "You want a lot of things tonight." The younger deputy shifted his weight, glancing at the discarded recorder, saying nothing, eyes flicking toward his partner's pocket. Halsey spun Justine around without asking, cuffs ratcheting tight over her wrists. She didn't resist, didn't flinch. At Ashgrove Station, the fluorescent lights buzzed steady over a booking counter stained with old coffee rings. Captain Osgood set a blank report form in front of Halsey. Write that she refused to comply with a lawful search. "She never refused anything," Halsey muttered, pen hovering. Osgood tapped the page twice. "Write it anyway." Down the hall, a young clerk named Priya watched through the glass, quietly jotting the booking time into her own notebook. Osgood took the memory card from Halsey's palm, turned to a laptop, and began formatting it a second time. Priya, unseen behind the server rack, noted the file had synced automatically to the county's remote backup an hour earlier. In a holding cell smelling of bleach, Justine was allowed one call. She dialed her sister instead of her office. "I'm fine," she said quietly, watching Simone through the bars, still wrapped in a deputy's spare jacket. Her sister's voice cracked. "Should I call someone?" "Not yet," Justine said. "Let it play out clean." Simone, sitting stiff on a bench outside the cell, kept replaying her phone video, thumb hovering over the share button. A passing officer noticed the timestamp on her screen and told her to put the phone away. She didn't. By the time Simone reached the parking lot, the video already had 4,000 views, climbing fast. By midnight, the station's front desk phone had not stopped ringing. Osgood snatched it up on the fourth call, pressed it hard against his ear, and immediately dropped his voice into the practiced, reasonable tone he used for reporters. "There's no story here," he said. "Routine stop, routine paperwork." He hung up before the caller could respond, and it rang again within seconds. Across the bullpen, two deputies hunched over a shared phone screen, the glow lighting their faces from below. "It's past 10,000, one of them murmured. "Halsey's face is right there in frame." Halsey himself sat near the coffee station, arms crossed, still unbothered. "It's a car window," he said. "People break car windows every day." Nobody answered him. Osgood snapped his fingers at Priya, who was filing paperwork near the counter. "Get me the incident log, the clean version." Priya's hands paused over the folder for half a second too long before she nodded and walked toward the file room, taking the long way past the server rack instead of the short way past his desk. The phone rang a third time. This one Osgood let go to voicemail, staring at it like it might stop on its own if he ignored it long enough. Outside, a patrol car pulled into the lot, headlights sweeping briefly across the station's front windows before cutting off. A deputy stepped out, phone already to his ear, pacing in a tight circle near the flagpole, glancing back at the building every few seconds like he expected someone to come outside and tell him what to say. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed the same steady buzz they always did, indifferent to the fact that the room's temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees in the last 20 minutes. Halsey finally stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the parking lot lights glowing orange against the dark. "It'll blow over," he said, mostly to himself. Osgood didn't look up from the growing stack of message slips beside the phone, ink smudged where his hand had been resting on it too long. "It's not blowing anywhere," he said quietly. "It's growing." Somewhere down the hall, a printer began spitting out pages nobody had asked for yet, the mechanical clatter oddly loud in the sudden hush that had settled over the bullpen. Everyone listening to phones that weren't ringing and watching a door that hadn't opened yet, though every person in that room, without quite admitting it to themselves, had already started waiting for it to. The county's public information line rang next, and this time Osgood answered it himself, straightening his collar out of old habit before he even picked up the receiver, as if the caller could somehow see him through the line. "No comment on an active matter," he said, and hung up before the reporter finished her second question. He set the phone down harder than necessary, the plastic housing rattling against its cradle. Behind him, a deputy refreshed the video again, watching the number climb by the hundreds every few seconds now, comments scrolling faster than anyone could read them. Somewhere in that scroll, dozens of strangers were typing the same disbelieving question in different words. How does a registration confirmed on camera still end in broken glass? The kind of quiet, ordinary unfairness that never makes headlines until a phone happens to be pointed the right way at the right second, a stranger's video landing in front of exactly the person who needed to see it. The way a held-out hand sometimes finds the one reaching back. Osgood rubbed his forehead hard with 2 fingers, exhaling through his nose. "Get Halsey off the front page," he told nobody in particular. "Cameras off." Statements later. Halsey, still by the window, didn't move. "I did my job. Your job just cost us the whole precinct's phone lines," Osgood snapped, sharper than he meant to. A younger officer stepped half into the doorway, hesitated, then stepped back out without saying whatever he'd come to say. Priya, returning from the file room with a folder pressed to her chest, paused at the edge of the bullpen and watched the 2 men a moment longer than she needed to, memorizing the exact words without writing anything down this time. Some things were safer kept only in her head until the right person asked. Outside, the parking lot lights buzzed against the dark, and inside, the phone began ringing again before Osgood had even fully let go of it, his hand hovering over the receiver like he already knew answering it wouldn't help, and lifting it again anyway because the alternative, silence, waiting, not knowing what was coming next, felt worse than whatever voice was on the other end. The station's front door opened without a knock, letting in a gust of cold night air that scattered a stack of loose message slips off the counter. A man in a plain dark suit stepped through, unhurried, a leather badge case already open in one hand before anyone thought to ask who he was. He didn't stop at the counter. He walked straight past 2 deputies who instinctively stepped aside, without quite knowing why, and set the open badge case down flat on Osgood's desk, the gold shield catching the fluorescent light for a beat before Osgood even looked down at it. "Captain Osgood," the man said, voice even, unbothered by the sudden silence spreading through the bullpen behind him. "I need everything you have on tonight's traffic stop. Now." Osgood's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the badge, then at the man's face, then back at the badge, as if reading it twice might change what it said. "This is a county matter," he managed finally. "It was," the man said. "It stopped being one about 40 minutes ago." Behind the counter, the phone had gone quiet for the first time in an hour. as though even it understood something in the room had shifted. Halsey pushed off the window frame, stepping closer, still wearing the same loose, unbothered posture he'd carried since the roadside. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. Not quite a question, more a challenge. The man didn't look at him yet. His eyes stayed on Osgood. "Where is she being held?" Osgood's hand drifted toward the phone and stopped halfway, fingers curling into his palm instead. "Cell 3, he said quietly, all the earlier practiced calm gone from his voice. Priya, still standing near the file room doorway, watched the exchange without moving, folders still pressed to her chest, and for the first time all night allowed herself something close to a small, private breath of relief. The man closed the badge case with a soft click, slid it back into his jacket, and turned finally toward Halsey, taking him in fully for the first time. The sunglasses pushed up on his forehead, the loose stance, the complete absence of concern on his face, and something in the man's expression flickered, cold and unreadable, before he turned and started down the hallway toward the cells without another word, leaving both officers standing frozen in the sudden hush he'd left behind him. Down the narrow hallway, the man knocked once on the frame of cell 3 before stepping into view, and Justine looked up from where she sat on the metal bench, hands still faintly reddened from the cuffs that had been removed an hour earlier. "Director Marlowe," he said, and something in his voice carried a formality the station hadn't heard all night. "Harlan Boyd, Regional Office. I'm sorry it took this long to get here." Justine studied him a moment before standing, unhurried, brushing a fleck of glass dust from her coat sleeve with 2 fingers. "You made good time," she said simply. Behind Boyd, a deputy who'd followed him partway down the hall stopped dead in the doorway, eyes moving from Boyd to Justine and back again, mouth slightly open. "Regional office of what?" he asked, though nobody answered him directly. Boyd unlocked the cell door himself, waving off the deputy who fumbled for his own keys a beat too late. "She'll need her personal effects returned, and I'll need copies of every report filed tonight," he said, tone flat, procedural, the kind of calm that came from having done this exact walk down exact hallways more times than he cared to count. Justine stepped out into the corridor, rolling one shoulder slightly where Halsey's grip had wrenched it earlier, though her face gave away nothing of the discomfort. "Where's my daughter?" she asked. "In the lobby. Unharmed," Boyd said. "I checked first." Justine nodded once, satisfied, and started walking beside him back toward the bullpen, her pace unhurried despite everything that had happened in the last 2 hours. The deputy who'd followed them trailed a few steps behind, radio forgotten in his hand, clearly turning something over in his mind he didn't yet have words for. Near the file room, Priya watched them pass, and for just a moment, Justine's eyes met hers. A small, private acknowledgement, nothing more, the kind 2 people exchange when one of them has quietly done the right thing without being asked, and the other one noticed. Ahead of them, through the glass doors leading to the bullpen, the fluorescent lights buzzed on exactly as they had all night, though the air in the building had already begun to feel different, charged with the particular stillness that settles just before a room understands it has made a serious mistake. Justine's mind went back, unbidden, to a gravel driveway in another decade. Her father, sleeves rolled to the elbow, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that never quite got clean, the same brass key she now wore on a cord around her neck dangling from his fingers as he held it out to her. She'd been 16, furious over some small unfairness at school, ready to march back in and announce exactly who she was and what she deserved. Her father hadn't handed her the key right away. "A car doesn't decide who's allowed inside it," he'd said, turning the key slowly between his fingers, catching the porch light. "People do. And people who need to be told who you are before they'll treat you right were never going to treat you right anyway." She'd asked him, half angry, half confused, why that mattered. Why not just say it, get it over with, make them stop? He'd finally pressed the key into her palm, closing her fingers around it. "Because the day you have to announce yourself to be believed," he said, "is the day you find out exactly who somebody really is underneath the badge or the title or whatever they're hiding behind. Let them show you first." Then you'll know exactly what you're dealing with. She hadn't fully understood it then. She understood it now, sitting in a station hallway 2 decades later, glass dust still faintly clinging to her coat. Having said nothing about her title for 2 full hours while a deputy broke her window, and a captain rewrote a report to protect him. She hadn't stayed silent out of fear. She'd stayed silent because her father had taught her that silence, held with intention, was its own kind of evidence. It let a man's true character surface on its own, unprompted, uncoached, impossible to walk back later. Beside her now, Boyd waited a step ahead, patient, having apparently sensed she needed the extra second. Justine touched the key at her collarbone once, the way she always did before stepping into a room that was about to change, and continued walking, her expression as unreadable to Boyd as it had been to every deputy who'd looked straight through her tonight, without seeing anything at all. They reached the bullpen just as Osgood was hanging up the phone for what felt like the 100th time that night, his hand still hovering over the receiver when the glass door swung open and Boyd walked through it with Justine a step behind him. The room went quiet the way rooms do when everyone senses something before they understand what it is. Halsey, still near the window, turned first, his expression sliding from irritation to confusion as he took in the woman he'd cuffed on the roadside, now walking calmly through the bullpen with no cuffs at all, flanked by a man who'd walked in an hour ago and rearranged the entire station's mood with a single badge. "That's," Halsey started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Osgood stood up too fast, his chair scraping loud against the floor tile, coffee sloshing over the rim of his cup and onto a stack of papers he didn't bother to save. "Director Boyd," he said, the title landing wrong in his mouth, unpracticed. "I wasn't informed you'd already. You weren't informed of a lot of things tonight," Boyd said evenly, setting a thin folder on the counter between them. Justine stood a few feet back, hands loosely at her sides, watching the room rearrange itself around a fact it hadn't yet been told outright. Simone, waiting near the front entrance where a deputy had walked her in from the parking lot minutes earlier, spotted her mother and started forward, stopping herself at the edge of the room when she sensed the moment wasn't hers to interrupt yet. Halsey's eyes moved from Boyd to Justine, still searching for an explanation that made sense within the version of the night he'd already decided on. "Somebody want to tell me what's going on," he said, and for the first time since the traffic stop, there was the faintest crack of uncertainty threaded through his voice, small but unmistakable, the first sound all night that hadn't come out of him sounding entirely sure of himself. Boyd opened the thin folder on the counter, turning it so both Osgood and Halsey could see the top page without having to lean far. "This is the intake authorization for the National Narcotics Enforcement Directorate's Regional Oversight Review," he said, tapping one finger against a seal near the bottom corner. "Signed this evening, after your department's booking log hit a federal monitoring flag." Osgood's eyes moved fast over the page, comprehension arriving slower than the words did. "A monitoring flag," he repeated. "For what?" "For detaining a sitting federal director without cause, damaging federal property in the process, and improperly handling recovered digital evidence," Boyd said, each item landing with the flat weight of something already confirmed rather than alleged. Halsey's mouth opened, closed again. Federal director of what? He finally managed, and the question came out smaller than anything he'd said all night. Boyd didn't answer him directly. Instead, he glanced once toward Justine, a silent question of permission she answered with the barest nod, unhurried, entirely on her own terms. Boyd closed the folder. "You'll want to sit down for the rest of this conversation, deputy," he said, and something about the calm, almost gentle way he said it landed harder than shouting would have. Simone, still near the entrance, pressed her lips together, watching her mother's face for any sign of what was coming. Finding none, the same steady composure Justine had worn on the roadside 2 hours earlier still fixed perfectly in place. Priya, drifting closer from the file room under the excuse of returning a folder to its shelf, positioned herself where she could hear every word without appearing to listen at all, her earlier notebook entries suddenly feeling less like idle habit and more like something that might actually matter by morning. Outside, through the station's front windows, the parking lot lights burned steady over rows of parked patrol cars, indifferent to the fact that inside, the entire shape of the night was quietly, irreversibly turning over. Halsey didn't sit down. He stood rooted where he was, arms uncrossing slowly, like the posture he'd worn all night had simply stopped fitting him. "This is a mistake," he said, though the certainty that had carried him through the traffic stop was noticeably absent now, replaced by something closer to a man talking himself into a version of events he could still live with. "She never said anything. Never told me who she was. You never asked before you broke her window," Boyd said, not unkindly, simply stating it the way one states a fact already logged somewhere permanent. Osgood, still standing behind his desk, looked down at the report he'd instructed Halsey to write 2 hours earlier, the ink barely dry, and for the first time all night, said nothing at all, the silence itself an answer he clearly hadn't intended to give. Justine finally stepped forward, close enough now that Halsey had to actually look at her rather than past her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You had 2 confirmations tonight that the registration was valid," she said. "A phone call to the land office, and a recorder that was still running when you pulled the memory card out of it." Halsey's jaw worked, no answer arriving. "I want to know," Justine continued, "not why you didn't believe me. Why you didn't check." The bullpen had gone entirely silent now, every deputy who'd drifted close enough to listen standing frozen in place, none of them willing to be the one who spoke first into that particular silence. Simone, watching from the doorway, felt something in her chest loosen slightly for the first time since the baton had cracked against the window glass, though she didn't move yet, sensing correctly that this moment belonged entirely to her mother and no one else. Halsey's silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer, and when he finally spoke, it came out clipped, defensive, aimed less at Justine than at the room itself. "I've stopped 100 cars that looked exactly like that one," he said. "Nice car, nice clothes. Doesn't mean the paperwork's clean." Somewhere behind him, a deputy shifted his weight audibly, the small sound of boots against tile the only response anyone offered. Boyd's expression didn't change, but something in the way he tucked the folder back under his arm suggested the comment had just been noted, filed away alongside everything else that would matter later. Justine tilted her head slightly, studying Halsey with the same unreadable calm she'd carried since the roadside. 100 cars, she repeated. "How many of those belonged to people who looked like me?" Halsey didn't answer. Osgood, still behind his desk, reached for his coffee cup out of pure habit, found it empty, and set it back down without drinking from it, the small gesture betraying more nerves than anything he'd said all night. Priya, near the file room, kept her eyes down on the folder in her hands, though her pen had gone still against the page, every word in the room landing somewhere it would eventually be written down. Boyd checked his watch once, an unhurried, deliberate motion, and looked toward Justine. "Whenever you're ready," he said quietly, leaving the timing entirely in her hands, the way, Justine suspected, he'd been trained to leave it, because some moments were not his to rush, and this, standing in the exact bullpen where a deputy had spent the last 2 hours certain of his own righteousness, was clearly one of them. Boyd finally turned to face the room fully, and when he spoke, his voice carried clean across the bullpen, pitched exactly loud enough that no one, not even the deputies pretending to be busy near the far wall, could claim afterward they hadn't heard it. "For the record," he said, "this is Justine Marlowe, Regional Director of the National Narcotics Enforcement Directorate, overseeing interagency operations across 6 counties, including this one." The words landed and did not immediately leave. Halsey's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, something closer to dread, before settling into a stillness that looked almost physically painful to hold. His mouth opened once and produced no sound at all. Osgood's coffee cup, still empty, slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk, rolling once before he caught it, the small noise obscenely loud in a room that had otherwise gone completely silent. Nobody moved to fill the quiet. Simone, watching from the doorway, felt her own breath catch, not from surprise, she'd known for years, but from the sheer, visible weight of watching a room full of armed, uniformed men realize all at once exactly how badly they had misjudged the person standing in front of them. Justine herself didn't smile, didn't straighten with satisfaction, didn't do anything to make the moment easier for the men now staring at her. She simply stood there, hands loose at her sides, coat still faintly dusted with glass, and let the silence do the work her father had once told her silence was for. Halsey's eyes dropped, briefly, to her collarbone, to the small brass key still hanging there on its worn cord, as though some part of him understood, too late, that he'd been looking directly at the truth all night and had simply never bothered to ask what it meant. Somewhere near the counter, a deputy's radio crackled faintly, unanswered, the only sound in a bullpen that had otherwise gone completely, permanently still. The silence held for what felt like a full minute before Boyd broke it, turning to Justine with a question already forming on his face. "How would you like to proceed, Director?" Every eye in the room shifted toward her, waiting, and for a moment Justine simply looked around the bullpen slowly, taking in Halsey's frozen posture, Osgood's hand still resting on the coffee cup he'd nearly dropped, Priya standing quietly near the file room with her notebook held against her chest. "Not through me," Justine said finally. "I want an independent team on this. Not internal affairs, not this county. Federal review, starting tonight, and I want every piece of evidence pulled before anyone in this building has the chance to touch it again." Boyd nodded once, already reaching for his phone. "I'll have a unit here within the hour." Osgood, still visibly shaken, found his voice again, though it came out smaller than before. "Director Marlowe, if there's been some misunderstanding tonight, the department would like the opportunity to— The department had that opportunity 2 hours ago," Justine said, cutting him off without raising her voice. "When I told your deputy the registration was valid, and he chose not to check." Halsey, still standing near the window, finally spoke, his voice rough. "I didn't know who you were." "You didn't need to know who I was," Justine said, turning to look at him directly for the first time since the reveal. "You needed to follow the law regardless of who I was. That's the entire point." Nobody in the bullpen offered a rebuttal. Boyd finished his call and lowered the phone. "Federal teams en route," he confirmed. Justine nodded once, satisfied, and reached up to touch the small brass key at her collarbone, an old habit, grounding herself before whatever came next, while behind her, Simone finally crossed the room and slid an arm gently around her mother's shoulders, careful of the bruise already forming beneath her coat. Within the hour, 3 unmarked federal vehicles pulled into the Ashgrove station lot, headlights sweeping across the same parking spaces the county cruisers usually occupied. A team of investigators moved through the front doors with quiet efficiency, evidence cases in hand, and began sectioning off the bullpen with a calm that made the earlier chaos of ringing phones look almost quaint by comparison. One investigator, a woman introduced only as Agent Delgado, approached the counter where the discarded recorder still sat, untouched since Halsey had tossed it there hours earlier. She lifted it carefully with gloved hands, turning it over once. "This unit has a remote sync feature," she said, mostly to herself, though Boyd, standing nearby, caught the comment immediately, meaning the footage may already exist somewhere outside this building. Delgado nodded, already opening a laptop at the counter. "If it's the model I think it is, yes. It uploads automatically to a secured cloud server the moment it detects a Wi-Fi signal. The physical card being pulled wouldn't have stopped that." Across the room, Osgood's face went visibly pale. He hadn't known. Neither, judging by his expression, had Halsey, who was now sitting in a chair near the wall, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if it might offer some explanation he could use. Delgado's screen loaded a login portal, then a folder, then, finally, a video file with a timestamp matching the exact minute the recorder had gone dark on the roadside. "It's here," she said simply. Justine, watching from a few feet away, felt nothing resembling triumph, only a quiet, settled confirmation of something she'd already known would surface eventually. Priya, still lingering near the file room, allowed herself a small exhale, the kind that comes after holding something carefully for far longer than expected. Boyd looked toward Justine. We'll have a full report within the week, he said. Sooner, if the pattern review turns up what I think it will. Pattern review, Osgood repeated, the words clearly unfamiliar and unwelcome in his mouth. Delgado didn't look up from her screen. Deputy Halsey's personnel file shows 31 vehicle damage complaints filed against him over the past 6 years, she said, scrolling through a document that had populated almost instantly once the federal system pulled his badge number. Windows, mirrors, one dashboard camera reported malfunctioning during 3 separate stops. All closed as unsubstantiated. Halsey's head came up sharply. Those were reviewed. Cleared. By this department, Delgado said, still not looking at him. Internally. By the same captain who instructed you to write tonight's report a certain way. Osgood's mouth opened, but nothing useful came out of it. Boyd crossed his arms, studying the growing list of dates and case numbers on Delgado's screen, with the particular stillness of a man watching a theory confirm itself in real time. 31 complaints, he said, and not one referred outside this building. Justine, standing off to the side, felt Simone's hand tighten briefly around her arm, the number landing on her daughter the same way it landed on everyone else in the room. Not as an isolated bad night, but as a pattern that had simply never been interrupted until tonight by pure and mostly unplanned circumstance. How many of those 31 were luxury vehicles? Justine asked quietly. Delgado scrolled, checking. Nearly all of them. Nobody spoke for a moment. Halsey stared at the growing list on the screen like it belonged to a stranger, some other deputy's file that had simply been filed under his badge number by mistake, though the dates and locations lined up too precisely for that story to hold even in his own head. Boyd finally straightened, closing the moment with quiet finality. We'll need everyone in this building's files by morning, he said. Every deputy. Every stop. No exceptions. By early morning, 2 folding tables had been set up in the bullpen, stacked with pulled files, and Delgado laid a set of them out side by side in front of Osgood and Halsey, who now sat several feet apart from each other, neither looking at the other directly. I want to walk through these one at a time, Delgado said, tapping the first folder. March, 2 years ago. Vehicle window damaged during a stop you supervised, Captain. Report says the driver became combative. Dashcam from that stop is listed as corrupted. Osgood's jaw tightened. I don't recall the specifics of every stop. You signed off on it personally, Delgado said, sliding the signature page across the table. Halsey shifted in his chair, arms crossed tight over his chest. That one wasn't even mine. No, Delgado agreed. That one belonged to a different deputy, under your supervision, Captain, using language nearly identical to the report you had Deputy Halsey write tonight. The room had gone quiet again, everyone within earshot pretending to be occupied with something else while listening closely. Osgood's composure, carefully maintained since Boyd first walked in, finally began to fray at the edges. I reviewed reports for clarity. That's the job. Clarity, Delgado repeated, not quite a question, simply letting the words sit exposed in the air a moment before moving to the next folder. Halsey watched her hands moving through the stack, each new file another data point in a shape he was only now, belatedly, being forced to see whole. Justine, seated a short distance away with Simone beside her, watched the 2 men not look at each other, the careful distance between their chairs saying more than either of them had managed to say out loud all night. Boyd made a small note on his own pad, unhurried, the kind of documentation that would matter far more in a week than it did in this exact moment, though everyone in the room could already sense the shape the coming days were about to take. Who told you to write the report the way you wrote it tonight? Delgado asked, turning her full attention to Halsey now, the folders momentarily set aside. Halsey's eyes flicked toward Osgood, then away. Captain Osgood reviewed it before I submitted it. Reviewed, or dictated? Delgado asked. A long pause. He told me what language to use, Halsey said finally, the words coming out reluctant, like each one cost him something. Osgood's head snapped toward him. That's not what happened, and you know it. You stood over my shoulder and told me to write refused to comply, Halsey said, louder now. Some of his earlier defensiveness redirecting itself squarely at the man beside him instead of the room at large. I didn't format that memory card twice, Captain. You did that yourself, at your own desk, on your own laptop. Osgood's face reddened. I was preserving the integrity of the file. You were erasing it, Delgado said flatly, no longer bothering to phrase it as a question. The two men stared at each other now, the carefully maintained appearance of a unified department finally, visibly cracking apart in front of the exact federal team, documenting every second of it. Priya, standing near enough to hear clearly, felt her earlier notebook entries settle into place in her mind. Each timestamp she'd quietly recorded over the last several hours now aligning precisely with the contradiction unfolding in front of everyone. Justine watched without expression, recognizing the shape of it immediately. Two men who had spent years protecting each other discovering, in real time, that the alliance had never been loyalty at all, only convenience, and convenience always broke first under direct questioning. Boyd closed his notepad. I think we have enough for tonight, he said quietly. The rest can wait for formal statements. By mid-morning, Halsey and Osgood had been moved into separate rooms at opposite ends of the station, each with an investigator and a closed door between them. The same tactic Justine had seen used 100 times in her own work, though she'd never expected to watch it play out from the outside, in the very building where it had all started. Through the narrow window of one office, she could see Osgood gesturing sharply at Delgado, his earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by something closer to panic dressed up as indignation. In the other room, visible from a different angle, Halsey sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, answering questions in short, clipped sentences, no longer bothering to defend the night's events so much as simply trying to survive the conversation. An hour passed, then another. When the two investigators finally stepped out to compare notes at the central table, their expressions told most of the story before either of them said a word. They don't match, the first investigator said simply, setting two printed statements side by side. Osgood claims Halsey acted independently and exceeded his authority. Halsey claims Osgood personally instructed the report language and ordered the card reformatted. Boyd studied both pages a moment. Which one's lying? Possibly both, about different things, the second investigator said. But the physical evidence backs Halsey on the reformatting order. Server logs show the laptop used belonged to Osgood, logged in under his credentials, both times. Justine, watching from a chair near the counter, felt no particular satisfaction in the confirmation, only the familiar, quiet click of a case settling into a shape that made sense. Simone, beside her, exhaled slowly. They really just turned on each other, she said, half to herself, still faintly disbelieving despite everything she'd already witnessed that night. They usually do, Justine said. The alliance was never about protecting each other. It was about protecting themselves. Separate them, and there's nothing left holding it together. Boyd gathered both statements, along with the server logs, and walked them personally into the room where Osgood sat, setting the pages down without a word. Osgood looked at them, then up at Boyd, some last defense visibly forming and then dying before it reached his mouth. I want to speak with a union representative, he said finally. You'll have one, Boyd said. But this file isn't going anywhere in the meantime. Down the hall, in the second office, a similar exchange was already underway, though Halsey's version of it came out quieter, more resigned. A union representative arrived within the hour for each man, and by the time the sun had fully cleared the station's parking lot, both officers sat in the bullpen once more, this time not standing near windows or leaning against counters with easy confidence, but seated stiffly at the same folding table where the evidence had first been laid out. waiting for a decision neither of them could influence anymore. The department's union representative for the county, a woman named Carla Finn, arrived and read a short prepared statement to both men without much visible sympathy in her voice. Effective immediately, pending the outcome of the federal review, Deputy Halsey and Captain Osgood are placed on unpaid suspension from all duties. She looked up from the page. Badges and weapons to be surrendered at this time. Halsey's hand went instinctively to his belt, fingers brushing the badge he'd worn without a second thought for 8 years, as if some part of him hadn't fully believed the words until his own hand confirmed they were real. Osgood said nothing at all, his earlier bluster entirely gone, replaced by the flat, hollowed expression of a man watching 3 decades of careful self-protection collapse in the space of a single morning. Justine watched from across the room, arms loosely crossed, and felt, for the first time since the roadside, something close to the beginning of rest. Halsey unclipped his badge slowly, the metal catching the morning light one last time before he set it flat on the counter, followed by his sidearm, laid down with the careful, deliberate motion of a man handling something that no longer entirely felt like his to hold. A few deputies who had worked alongside him for years stood near the edges of the bullpen, watching in a silence that carried none of the earlier tension, only a kind of flat, uncomfortable finality. Nobody stepped forward to say anything reassuring. Osgood followed a moment later, setting his own badge beside Halsey's with hands that weren't entirely steady, the gold captain's bars on his collar suddenly looking less like rank and more like something he'd have to explain to people for the rest of his life. Carla Finn collected both items into a small evidence bag without ceremony, sealing it with a strip of tape that made a small, final sound in the quiet room. "You'll be notified of the hearing date," she said, and stepped away toward the counter to log the surrender officially. Halsey stood there a moment longer, hands empty at his sides for what looked like the first time in years, glancing once around the bullpen at faces that had, until this morning, treated him as simply one of their own, and finding now only careful, averted eyes. One of the younger deputies who had stood near the cruiser on the roadside earlier that night, the one who'd called out that the registration was clean, met Halsey's gaze only briefly before looking away, and something in that small, deliberate avoidance seemed to land harder on Halsey than the suspension itself had. Justine watched the exchange from a distance, understanding exactly what was happening even if no one said it aloud. The badge had never been the real thing Halsey valued most. It was the easy, unquestioned respect of the room around him, the assumption that his word would simply be believed. That was the thing now visibly, irreversibly gone. Priya approached the counter just as Carla Finn finished logging the sealed evidence bag, holding her small notebook out in both hands like something she'd been waiting all night for the right moment to offer. "I have timestamps," she said quietly, to Boyd rather than to either suspended officer. "Booking time, the memory card reformatting, when the report language changed between drafts. I wrote it all down as it happened, before I knew who Director Marlowe was." Boyd took the notebook carefully, flipping through several pages of small, careful handwriting, each entry marked with a precise time down to the minute. "Why didn't you say anything earlier tonight?" he asked, not unkindly. Priya glanced briefly toward Osgood, who was watching her now with an expression that had nothing left in it to threaten her with. "Because earlier tonight, saying something would have gotten the notebook thrown out and me fired before anyone believed it mattered," she said simply. "I figured it mattered more staying quiet and keeping it accurate than speaking up and having it disappear." Justine, listening a few feet away, felt something shift slightly in her chest, recognition, maybe, of a smaller version of the same calculation she'd made on the roadside herself, silence held with intention rather than fear. Boyd closed the notebook gently. "This will matter a great deal," he said. "More than you probably realize yet." Priya nodded, some of the tension finally easing from her shoulders, and glanced once toward Justine, who returned the look with something close to a private, wordless thank you passed between two people who had each, in their own separate way, chosen to wait rather than speak too soon. "Halsey," still standing near the counter with his hands empty at his sides, watched the exchange without commenting, understanding by now that every quiet, overlooked person in that station had apparently been paying far closer attention to him than he had ever bothered to pay to any of them. Before Halsey was let out through the station's rear entrance, he stopped near the doorway where Justine stood with Simone, hesitating in a way that suggested he'd rehearsed something and lost the words the moment he needed them. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I really didn't know." "I know you didn't," Justine said evenly. "That's not actually the problem." Halsey waited, as if expecting her to elaborate, to soften it somehow. And when she didn't, something in his expression settled into a quieter, more honest kind of discomfort than the confusion he'd worn all night. "The problem," Justine continued, "was never that you didn't recognize a title. It's that you needed one to treat me like a person whose word was worth checking before you broke her window." Halsey had no response to that, and didn't try to manufacture one. Behind him, Carla Finn gestured toward the door, and he turned to follow her out, glancing back once at the bullpen, at the counter where his badge now sat sealed in a bag, at the folding table stacked with 31 files he'd never expected anyone to add up, at the handful of colleagues who wouldn't quite meet his eyes anymore, before the door swung shut behind him with a soft mechanical click that seemed unreasonably final for something so small. Osgood followed a few minutes later, escorted separately, his exit drawing considerably less attention than Halsey's had, most of the room already having moved on to the practical business of what came next. Simone let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. "Is that it?" she asked quietly. Justine touched the brass key at her collarbone, watching the door where Halsey had just disappeared. "That's the start of it," she said. "The rest happens on paper, over the next few weeks. But the part that mattered most already happened tonight, in this room, in front of everyone who needed to see it." 3 weeks later, in the small kitchen of her Arlington townhouse, Justine set a fresh pot of coffee to brew and stood for a moment at the window, watching the early light settle over the quiet street outside. On the counter beside her sat a small padded envelope, delivered that morning, containing the returned recorder from the Maybach along with an official letter confirming the video's admission into the Federal Review file. She hadn't opened the envelope yet. Simone wandered in, still half asleep, pulling a mug down from the cabinet without being asked, and glanced at the envelope on the counter. "You gonna read it?" she asked. "Already know what it says," Justine replied, though she picked it up anyway, turning it over once in her hands before setting it back down, unopened, beside the coffee maker. She reached instead for the small brass key at her collarbone, running her thumb once across its worn edge, an old habit that had carried her through court hearings, community town halls, and now, apparently, roadside traffic stops as well. "Dad would have liked Boyd," Simone said, pouring coffee into her mug. "The quiet, patient type. Dad would have told him he took too long getting there," Justine said, a faint, rare smile touching her mouth. Simone laughed softly, leaning against the counter. "You never told me exactly why you always wear that key instead of just keeping it in a drawer somewhere." Justine considered the question for a moment, glancing toward the window again, the quiet street outside entirely unremarkable, exactly the kind of ordinary morning she'd been fighting, in her own patient way, to make a little more possible for people who didn't have a federal title behind them to make it happen. "Because some mornings," she said finally, "I need the reminder that patience isn't the same thing as doing nothing." Simone nodded slowly, turning that over, and for a while neither of them said anything else, the kitchen quiet except for the soft, steady sound of coffee finishing its brew. That same afternoon, back at Ashgrove County Sheriff's Station, Priya stood at the front counter reviewing a stack of new intake forms, a laminated badge now clipped to her blouse that read Evidence and Records Compliance Officer, a position created 2 weeks earlier as part of the department's newly mandated oversight procedures. A young deputy approached with a folder, hesitating slightly before setting it down. "New stop log," he said. "Traffic stop on Route 9, about an hour ago. Wanted to make sure it got filed correctly." Priya opened the folder, scanning quickly. "Registration verified by phone at the scene, Driver cooperative, no equipment damage reported. Dashcam footage automatically synced and confirmed within the file. She looked up. "This is good work," she said, and meant it. The deputy nodded, visibly relieved, and something about his posture suggested the new procedures had already started reshaping small, ordinary habits across the department, one routine stop at a time. Through the front window, a patrol car pulled into the lot, and the same young deputy from the roadside weeks earlier stepped out, walking toward the entrance with a folder of his own. No longer the deputy who'd once stood silent near a cruiser while a window shattered a few feet away, but someone who'd apparently taken the last 3 weeks seriously. Priya filed the new report into its proper place, glancing once at the small brass plaque recently mounted near the station's front entrance. A single shard of glass, framed behind protective film, no explanation printed beneath it, just a date. Most people who passed it without knowing the story assumed it was simply decoration. The people who did know understood exactly what it meant, and exactly why it had been placed at eye level, right where every deputy walking in for their shift would have to pass it, every single day, whether they looked at it or not.